For the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchain men in servitude to themselves. For they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. Sauron convinces Ar-Pharazôn and the Númenóreans that God is a lie, that God is the invention of the Valar, their true enemies. Sauron pushes forward and spreads the belief that God does not exist, but he also does something infinitely worse. You might say that Sauron, as a being that can only be described in his core as an angel, knows God. He was created by God. He has sung in God's music of creation. Despite this, Sauron does not believe in God. In this video, we'll examine the true nature of Sauron and discover what he truly believes in. For starters, it is important to mention that within the context of the Lord of the Rings, God undeniably exists. And not only does he exist, but he's portrayed as a force of good and truth itself, in the lines of Tolkien's own Catholicism. And in that sense, atheism is described as a bad thing. With that said, Sauron begins as Mairon, the Admirable. He starts as an angel of good, a holy spirit created by Eru Ilúvatar himself. Mairon is incredibly powerful, and he has a love for crafting, as well as an incredible skill for it. Originally, he is an apprentice to Aule the Smith himself, the father of the dwarves, under whom he learns the skills required to become the Lord of the Rings, even though he did not know it yet. However, alongside his love for crafting, develops something else. Something more, a love for order, for planning, for coordination. He adores efficiency. All of these things come together and become one singular thing, domination. Though he greatly loved the earth and its creatures, and his peers and their crafts, his love for order and what it had become turned him to hate. He hated inefficiency, he opposed confusion, and he detested chaos. And in the midst of all this, he began to admire Melkor. He was astounded by his power and his authority, how he dominated everything. He joined his ranks and became his greatest lieutenant, and though not as evil in the beginning, as time passed, he fell more and more from Mairon the Admirable and became Sauron the Abhorred. Unlike Melkor, however, he never had any hate for the world itself. He did not wish to destroy it, but merely to rule it, turn it into his own utopia, ran as efficiently and as orderly as possible. Remember this fact, it will be useful later. There is a reason Sauron is known as the Great Deceiver. He always had a way with words. When his master was defeated for good at the end of the War of Wrath and sent to the Void, Sauron feigned repentance for his evil deeds, but when asked to come to Valinor and face the judgment of the Valar, he refused and hid in Middle-earth. Throughout the Second Age, he grew in strength, and in the disguise of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, he fooled the elves into helping him forge the Rings of Power, before making his own Master Ring to rule all else, and through them, rule Middle-earth. The important thing to take away from this is that in order to fool the elves, he focused on what they feared the most, the fading of the world. It is through his promise that the rings could maintain the magic of the world that the elves were deceived. It will not be the last time Sauron uses someone's fear to take advantage of them. Unfortunately for Sauron, however, it did not go as planned, and his ploy was discovered, and war came over Middle-earth yet again. Sauron managed to defeat his enemies and conquer almost the entirety of Middle-earth. From east to west, the land was his and his alone, except for the elves that remained, and of course, Númenor. It is at this time that Sauron truly embraces the idea that he is more than what he actually is. He becomes more arrogant and more self-absorbed than ever before. He becomes more evil too. When he served Melkor, he was but a servant, but now it is he who is the Lord. And if his search for order and domination consumed before, it consumed him 100-fold once he actually obtained the power to back his claims up. He declared himself King of Kings, King of Men, Lord of the Earth, and Lord of the World. Before, Melkor used to be above him. Before, he was someone's hand. He was merely a weapon to be wielded. Now that Melkor was gone, not even Eru or the Valar were above him. His arrogance grew and had no bounds. The Númenóreans had different plans. Upon hearing Sauron's declaration, Ar-Pharazôn sailed to Middle-earth with a force of arms so great that Sauron's army fled, and the Lord of the World surrendered and was taken hostage to Númenor. Whether he surrendered on purpose is up to you to decide. Nonetheless, Sauron did what he did best. He used someone's greatest fear against them. The Númenóreans had grown incredibly wealthy and powerful, and they were at the peak of their physical power. Simultaneously, however, their spiritual power was at the lowest it had ever been up to that point. With their longer lifespans, they had managed to forge the greatest empire in the history of the world, and they had grown to wealth unnumbered, and yet they were miserable. They were miserable because regardless of what they did in life, they could never escape death. Though death was a gift, they feared it. They detested it. They hated the unknown. They hated that, even though they were the most powerful in life, they had no control about their ultimate fate, a fate that would always meet them. Sauron knew this. The Númenóreans had already grown distrustful of the Valar and the Elves and the teachings of Ilúvatar way before Sauron had set foot upon their island. But it was Sauron that pushed them over the edge. He seemed to confirm their suspicions that God had no plan for them and that the Valar were their true enemies. Sauron wanted the Númenóreans out of the way in order to complete his domination of the world. Whether they be followers or destroyed, it did not matter. He wanted them gone. As a captive, however, this was difficult. Instead, he realized that in order to achieve his goal, the Númenóreans themselves had to do it for him. His plan was to corrupt them to the fullest extent, to take an already spiritually devastated nation and drag whatever soul they had left through the mud, to remove any sort of fear of the divine within them, and not only remove it, but turn it to hate. He needed to find a way to concentrate their hate and their fears into one thing, into one god, into a different god, into a god he could control. He knew that he had just been humiliated by them in battle, so it could not be him. He needed something else. Darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord thereof may yet make other worlds to be gifts to those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end. And Ar-Pharazôn said, "Who is the Lord of Darkness?" Then behind locked doors Sauron spoke to the king, and he lied. And thus comes into play the Dark Lord Morgoth, the one that Sauron had admired so deeply in the past, but whom he had now spiritually outgrown. He turned the Númenóreans from Eru Ilúvatar, from God, to the embrace of the devil himself, all the while lying and calling God a fabrication of the Valar, their supposed true enemies. He convinced them that Melkor was the ultimate power in the world, and only through his worship would they be able to overcome their fate of death and become all-powerful, something that Eru would and could never do for them. This is the center of Sauron's supposed atheism. It is not that he does not believe that a god exists, he knows for a fact that he does. He simply sees himself, like his master before him, as something greater than God, and he uses the cult that he creates to take the fear of God out of men and turn them to debauchery and murder, to human sacrifice, to worshipping the devil, while Sauron is pulling all the strings in the background and climbing the ladder from prisoner to chief advisor to the most powerful king in the entire world. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom. And his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they. He created for the Númenóreans a god that never said no, a god that allowed them to sin as they wished, that forbade nothing and promised everything while doing it. He was not a sincere atheist in the sense of disbelief, but rather a fake atheist that knew God existed, but preached atheism nonetheless. Atheism because in a world where Eru as God is fact and Melkor as God is not, the artificial religion of the latter, orchestrated by someone who knows Eru exists, is atheism in itself. He fosters Númenórean disbelief in Ilúvatar and then weaponizes it. The Númenóreans build a temple to the darkness where they sacrifice people, where they destroy Nimloth the Fair, the white tree, which up to that point had been a symbol of their people. The Númenóreans start to forget their true selves, what made them great, and the reason they have these long lifespans and the entire island to begin with. With their spiritual decline, they rise ever higher physically, but their hubris, orchestrated by Sauron himself, has no end. At the culmination of all this, they are convinced to break the rules of this old and fake god. They break the ban of the Valar, the rule that said no man shall sail so far west that he no longer sees Númenor, and with a massive fleet they wage war against the Undying Lands in order to claim immortality for themselves, as that is the wish of the darkness, the true god, or rather, Sauron, its high priest. The result is the intervention of Eru Ilúvatar himself, who decides to inflict the most severe punishment upon the nation of Númenor for their arrogance and lack of faith. He wipes them out entirely and sinks their island to the bottom of the ocean, with only those still faithful to him escaping. Sauron had accomplished his goal. Though he had not expected the severity of Ilúvatar's reaction, he had achieved the destruction of his greatest enemy, and though injured, he returned to Middle-earth and continued his domination of the world, his position much more powerful than before. In fact, in the Third Age, he even declares himself God King, and Morgoth returned, this time not claiming to be a mere representative, but the first Dark Lord himself, deserving the worship and admiration of all. His actions are so impactful, and the cult of Morgoth in Númenor left a taste in the mouth of the Dúnedain so bitter that you will find no organized religious structure in Gondor, and the people there do not worship. But what are we to truly make of all this? I think what it ultimately comes down to is what Tolkien himself has also said. Sauron is not a sincere atheist. He knows that God exists. What he is, however, is arrogant. He uses atheism, in this case the lack of belief in Ilúvatar and belief in something fake, in order to increase his influence and achieve his goals, and ultimately taking the spot of both Ilúvatar and Melkor, and declaring himself God King, something he is worshipped as likely by the majority of Middle-earth, as his dominion covers most of the continent. It is arrogance that characterizes him, whether it be towards Eru or what the Lord of the Rings ultimately came down to. Him being too arrogant to believe that the hobbits had infiltrated Mordor, being too arrogant to accept anyone had the mental strength of destroying the ring, and arrogance is what made him turn his forces towards Aragorn and the men of the West, and leave Mount Doom unprotected. Sauron does not believe in God, because he believes in himself more. Thank you very much for watching.